At 4 o'clock in the morning on August 23rd, 1987, the crew of a Union Pacific freight train, 75 cars long and over a mile in length, spotted something on the tracks about 300 feet ahead, near a trestle bridge in Saline County, Arkansas. Two shapes, human shapes, lying perfectly parallel between the rails, legs across the tracks, arms straight down at their sides. A pale green tarp partially covered them. A .22 rifle lay alongside them. The engineer hit the horn. Nothing. No movement, no reaction. The train could not stop in time. By 4:40 that morning, local and state police had arrived. Dental records would identify the bodies as Kevin Ives, 17, and Don Henry, 16. Best friends from the town of Bryant, just down the road. They'd gone out hunting late on Saturday night and hadn't come home. Their families were devastated, but at that point they had no reason to believe the system would fail them. The state would investigate. The medical examiner would determine what happened. Justice would follow. That's how it's supposed to work. In this case, almost none of it did. The Arkansas State Medical Examiner at the time was a man named Dr. Fahmy Malek. Malek concluded that Kevin and Don had smoked the equivalent of 20 marijuana cigarettes, fallen into what he called a deep state of unconsciousness, and simply never heard, saw, or felt a massive freight train bearing down on them while blaring its emergency horn. He ruled the deaths accidental. Now, I want to pause here because I think it's important to understand just how strange this ruling was. 20 marijuana cigarettes is an extraordinary amount. To put this in some kind of context, I am not aware of any documented case in which marijuana rendered someone so unconscious that they couldn't be woken by a diesel horn at close range. More importantly, every toxicologist who later reviewed the case said the same thing: the only reliable test for drug levels, mass spectrometry, had never been performed. But it gets worse. When the families refused to accept the ruling and pushed for a second opinion, a forensic pathologist from Georgia named Dr. Joseph Burton conducted a second autopsy. What he found changed everything. Cuts in the fabric of Don Henry's t-shirt indicated that he had been stabbed in the back before the train ran over him. Kevin Ives' skull had been struck repeatedly with a blunt instrument. Both boys, according to Burton and 5 additional pathologists who concurred, were dead before they were ever placed on those tracks. Dr. Burton also found something else. When performing his original autopsy, Dr. Malek had sawed Kevin's skull in multiple directions, making it nearly impossible to determine where the initial fractures had occurred. Whether this was incompetence or something more deliberate is something I'll leave to you, but the result was the same: critical evidence was effectively destroyed. In July 1988, a grand jury reversed Dr. Malek's finding. The deaths were reclassified first as undetermined, then as probable homicides, and ultimately as homicides. The public demanded that Malek be fired. He wasn't. And I need to address why, because this is where the case starts to feel much larger than 2 boys on a railroad track. Dr. Fahmy Malek was widely described as a close associate of the sitting governor of Arkansas at the time, despite a string of bizarre rulings in other cases, and there were many, he remained in his position. The governor resisted calls for his dismissal. Many in Arkansas believed that Malik was protected by what they called the state's good old boy system. And I should note here that none of this has ever been proven to be anything more than political loyalty and institutional inertia. There is no evidence that the governor was personally involved in any cover up, but the perception that the medical examiner who botched this case was politically untouchable did enormous damage to public trust. Then there was the sheriff. Saline County Sheriff James Steed continued to insist that foul play was not involved even after the grand jury ruled otherwise. He refused to authorize funds for the investigation, and the prosecutor assigned as special counsel to the grand jury a man named Dan Harmon would later be convicted of racketeering, drug possession, and extortion. Harmon, the man tasked with finding out who killed Don Henry, and Kevin Ives was a drug dealer. And then the witnesses started dying. Keith Coney was the first person to come forward. He'd been with Don and Kevin the night they died. According to family and friends, he told people that law enforcement officials were responsible for the murders. In January 1989, before he could testify, before the grand jury, Keith Coney was found dead. The official cause was a motorcycle accident, though circumstances surrounding it remain disputed. Less than 3 weeks later, Gregory Collins, another witness, called to testify before the same grand jury was killed by 3 shotgun blasts. A third witness, Daniel Bearden, disappeared without a trace in March of that year. A fourth, Jeffrey Edward, was found dead in a landfill the following month. Now, I have to be careful here. 1 witness dying can be a coincidence. 2 is alarming. 4 in the space of a few months, all connected to the same grand jury investigation, is a pattern that I find very difficult to dismiss. But I also have to acknowledge that each of these deaths taken individually has explanations that don't require a conspiracy. Motorcycle accidents happen. People do get shot in rural Arkansas for reasons that have nothing to do with a grand jury. The pattern is what's disturbing, not any single incident. The theory that draws the most serious attention is that Don and Kevin stumbled onto a drug drop that night. A delivery by small aircraft, possibly connected to the broader drug trafficking operations that were allegedly running through Mena Airport in Polk County, Arkansas, during the 1980s. If the boys saw something they shouldn't have, they would have become a liability to people with an enormous amount to lose. That theory has never been proven. But consider what we know for certain: the medical examiner lied or was catastrophically wrong. The sheriff refused to investigate. The prosecutor assigned to the case was himself a criminal, and multiple witnesses died before they could testify. You don't need a conspiracy theory to see that something went deeply wrong here. You just need to look at the system that was supposed to protect 2 16- and 17-year-old boys and ask why at every single step it did the opposite. Linda Ives. Kevin's mother spent decades fighting for answers. She passed away in June 2021 at the age of 71. She never got them. Dan Harmon, the corrupt prosecutor, died in September 2023. No one has ever been charged with the murders of Don Henry and Kevin Ives. There's a small town on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, Australia, called Boraville. About 2,000 people. The kind of place most Australians have never heard of unless they're from the region. Just outside the town center, roughly 2 kilometers down the road, is a single street of red brick houses that the locals call the Mission. This is where Bowraville's Aboriginal community lives. In 1990 and 1991, 3 children disappeared from that street. Same community, same 5-month window. Their remains were found off the same dirt track leading out of town. One suspect has been identified from the very beginning. He has never been convicted. What happened in Bowraville isn't complicated. What makes it devastating is why. Colleen Walker Craig was 16 years old. On September 13, 1990, she attended a party in the Mission. A local white laborer named Jay Hart was seen loitering around the party that night. The following day, Colleen's family reported her missing to the police. What happened next, or rather what didn't happen next, set the pattern for everything that followed. No search parties were formed. No formal action was taken. According to the family, the police didn't take the report seriously. One officer reportedly suggested the girl had probably gone walkabout, a term rooted in a stereotype about Aboriginal people, that in this context amounted to saying, she's Aboriginal, she'll turn up. She didn't. Colleen's body has never been found. Her clothing was later discovered weighted down with rocks in the Nambucca River. Less than 3 weeks later, on October 4th, Colleen's 4-year-old cousin, Evelyn Greenup, disappeared from a house 3 doors up from where Colleen was last seen. Evelyn had been put to bed with her mother. Witnesses reported seeing Jay Hart outside the window of the room where the child was sleeping. One witness heard Evelyn crying in the night, then a loud thump, after which Evelyn stopped. Later that night, Hart was seen rushing out of the house. The next morning, Evelyn was gone. Her mother and her sister went to the police station. The reception, according to the family, was similar to what Colleen's family had received. No urgency, no forensics. 4 months later, on January 31st, 1991, 16-year-old Clinton Speedy DeRue disappeared after attending a party. Jay Hart had been drinking with him that night in a rundown caravan. Clinton's remains were found 2 weeks later in bushland, the same bushland where Evelyn's skeletal remains would later be discovered. 3 children, same street, 5 months. Same suspect connected to all 3 disappearances. And yet what the families got from the police was not a murder investigation. When they demanded that detectives from the city come to help, the authorities sent an officer from Child Protection to investigate the families. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it reveals the actual mechanism of failure here. The police did not look at 3 missing Aboriginal children and see a potential serial killing. They looked at 3 missing Aboriginal children and assumed the problem was the parents. Now, I have to be fair. Policing a remote community with limited resources is genuinely difficult. Not every failure is motivated by racism. Some of it is incompetence, some is understaffing, and some is the routine institutional inertia that affects cases everywhere. I acknowledge that. But what makes Bowraville different is the specificity of the failure. The police didn't just fail to investigate, they failed to connect 3 disappearances from the same street over 5 months involving the same suspect. That isn't a resource problem. That's a pattern recognition problem. And the reason they didn't see the pattern is because the victims were Aboriginal. If 3 white children had vanished from a suburban street in Sydney under the same circumstances, I find it very hard to believe the response would have been the same. And I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. It wasn't until 1997, 7 years later, that a homicide detective named Gary Jublin was assigned to the case and a proper investigation actually began. By then, critical forensic evidence from Hart's caravan was long gone. No one had thought to secure it in 1990. Jublin would later describe how long it took him to earn the community's trust. The families had been burned so many times by the system that they had no reason to believe this detective would be any different. He was by most accounts. But he was also 7 years too late. And here's where the legal dimension becomes important. Jay Hart was tried for Clinton Speedy DeRue's murder in 1994 and acquitted. He was tried again for Evelyn Greenup's murder in 2006 separately because the law would not allow the cases to be heard together and acquitted again. This is a critical point that I think a lot of people miss when they hear about this case. The families and investigators have long argued that the 3 murders are the work of one person. If a jury heard all 3 cases together, the same street, the same time frame, the same suspect, the same method, the picture would be overwhelming. But because of how the legal system works, each case was heard in isolation. A jury considering only Clinton's death sees one set of evidence. A jury considering only Evelyn's sees another. Neither sees the full pattern. After legal reforms in New South Wales changed the double jeopardy laws, partly because of this very case, prosecutors attempted to have Hart retried with all 3 cases presented together. The application went all the way to the High Court of Australia. It failed. The court ruled that the evidence being presented was not sufficiently fresh to justify a retrial. There was potentially important evidence from a truck driver who had seen a man matching Hart's description near what appeared to be a body on a road, likely Clinton's placed there to be run over and disguise the crime. But because this evidence had not been raised during the original proceedings, even though it should have been, it could not now be used as grounds for retrial. That ruling in 2019 effectively closed the last legal avenue the families had. In 2016, the New South Wales Police Commissioner traveled to Bowraville and formally apologized to the families for the failures of the original investigation. The families had said from the beginning that if Colleen's case had been taken seriously, in September 1990, Evelyn and Clinton might still be alive. That apology, however welcome, does not change the outcome. As recently as October 2025, police conducted a new 2-day search for Colleen Walker Craig's remains. 35 years on. Her mother, Muriel Craig, has said she doesn't want to leave this earth without knowing where her daughter is. Jay Hart has since changed his name. He maintains that the accusations have ruined his life. He remains innocent in the eyes of the law. And the law in this case is precisely the problem. Hey everyone, if you're finding this one as unsettling as I am, consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps more than you'd think. All right, let's continue. On the afternoon of October 15th, 1987, a group of armed soldiers surrounded a government building in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. Inside, a meeting of the National Revolutionary Council was underway. When the shooting started, the man at the center of the room reportedly turned to his colleagues and said 7 words. It's me they want. Stay here. He walked out of the building to face the guns. He was shot multiple times. 12 of his aides and advisors were killed alongside him. He was 37 years old. His name was Thomas Sankara, and what happened that afternoon was not a mystery. The man who ordered it was his closest friend. But the question of who was behind his closest friend and why the truth took 35 years to reach even a courtroom is a story that, in my view, reaches far beyond a single country in West Africa. To understand why Sankara's death matters so much, you have to understand what he was doing while he was alive. And I want to be careful here because it would be easy to turn this into a hagiography, a story of a perfect leader cut down by dark forces. Sankara was a complicated figure. He did things that deserve criticism. But the scale of what he accomplished in 4 years is genuinely extraordinary. Thomas Sankara came to power in a military coup on August 4th, 1983. He was 33 years old. He inherited a country called Upper Volta, a name given to it by France, the former colonial power. One of the first things he did was rename it Burkina Faso, drawing from 2 native languages, the land of upright men. What followed was a rapid program of reform that reads like a checklist of things wealthy nations still struggle with. In 4 years, Sankara vaccinated 2.5 million children against meningitis, yellow fever, and measles. He launched a national literacy campaign. He planted 10 million trees to push back the advance of the Sahara Desert. He banned female genital cutting. He appointed women to positions in government and made women's empowerment a central pillar of state policy in a region where that was and often still is virtually unheard of. He cut the salaries of all government officials, including his own. He sold the presidential fleet of Mercedes-Benz cars and made the Renault 5 the cheapest car available in the country, the official vehicle of the government. He refused to use air conditioning in his office when most of his citizens couldn't afford it. When he died, his personal possessions reportedly amounted to a bicycle, a refrigerator, a broken guitar, and a modest military salary sitting in a bank account. He also made powerful enemies. Sankara publicly called for African nations to refuse to pay their debts to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. He called out French neo-colonial influence on the continent, what's known as France-Afrique, in terms that were blunt, public, and deeply embarrassing to Paris. At the Organization of African Unity, he told his fellow leaders, many of whom were quietly propped up by Western governments, exactly what he thought of them. Now, and this is where I have to push back against the hero narrative. A little Sankara's government was not democratic. He concentrated power, he dissolved opposition parties, and there were instances where revolutionary tribunals acted without adequate legal safeguards. Some of his own supporters complained that he announced sweeping initiatives without considering how they'd be implemented. He was a revolutionary, not a saint. And I think it's important to hold both things in your head at once, the vision and the contradictions. But here's what's undeniable. The policies he was pursuing directly threatened the economic interests of France and the broader Western order in West Africa. France maintained enormous influence over its former colonies through currency controls, military bases, and carefully placed allies. Sankara was openly trying to dismantle all of that. His best friend and fellow revolutionary, Blaise Compaoré, saw it differently. The relationship between Sankara and Compaoré had been deteriorating. They had taken power together, but Compaoré had grown increasingly aligned with elements that Sankara was trying to challenge, including France and neighboring Côte d'Ivoire, whose president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, was one of France's closest allies on the continent. On October 15, 1987, soldiers from Compaoré's personal guard attacked the building where Sankara was meeting. The assassins reportedly departed from Compaoré's own residence. Some used his vehicles. After the killing, Compaoré took power. He reversed nearly all of Sankara's policies. He aligned the country with France. He would rule for the next 27 years. And here's the part that I find most chilling. Sankara's death certificate listed his cause of death as natural causes. Natural causes. A man riddled with over a dozen bullets from Kalashnikov's pistols and automatic rifles. The death certificate wasn't corrected until 2008, 21 years later. For the duration of Compaoré's rule, no investigation into Sankara's murder was permitted. The bodies were buried hastily. The family's requests for an autopsy were denied. When Sankara's widow Mariam and others pushed for access to French government archives that might reveal Paris's role, the requests were ignored. It wasn't until 2014, when a popular uprising forced Compaoré to flee to Côte d'Ivoire, that the legal walls began to crack. In 2015, Sankara's body was exhumed. The autopsy confirmed what everyone already knew: he had been shot to death. In October 2021, 34 years after the assassination, a trial finally opened in Ouagadougou. 14 people were charged, including Compaoré and his security chief, Hyacinthe Kafando, both tried in absentia. In April 2022, a military tribunal convicted Compaoré and sentenced him to life in prison. The trial heard more than 110 witnesses. The judiciary confirmed the presence of French intelligence agents in Ouagadougou on October 16, 1987, the day after the coup. And that's the question that the trial, for all its importance, did not fully answer: what was France's role? The circumstantial case is extensive. Sankara's policies were a direct threat to French economic control. Compaoré immediately reversed those policies upon taking power. France has consistently refused to declassify documents related to the assassination, despite presidential promises to do so. And French agents were confirmed to be in the capital the day after Sankara was killed. But circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, is not proof. And I think it's worth acknowledging that there are domestic explanations for what happened that don't require foreign involvement. Revolutionary governments generate internal enemies. Sankara's concentration of power and his impatience with dissent had alienated people within his own movement. Compaoré may have acted purely out of personal ambition, without any foreign puppet master pulling the strings. I don't believe that's the full story. But I also don't have the evidence to prove it isn't, and neither does anyone else, because the documents that might settle the question are sitting in an archive in Paris that no one has been allowed to open. And that really is the thread that connects all three of these cases. It's not the violence. Violence tragically is common. It's the silence afterward. In Arkansas, a medical examiner lied, a prosecutor dealt drugs, witnesses died, and the system looked the other way. In Boerville, 3 children vanished from the same street, and the police investigated the families instead of the killer. In Burkina Faso, a man was shot a dozen times, and his death certificate said natural causes for 2 decades. In each case, the system didn't just fail, it participated. The people and institutions that were supposed to pursue truth either couldn't, wouldn't, or actively worked to bury it. And the common denominator in all three isn't a criminal mastermind or a shadowy conspiracy. It's something much simpler and much harder to fix. It's the decision made by someone with authority that certain deaths don't matter enough to investigate properly. That certain people, 2 teenagers from a small town, 3 Aboriginal children from a mission settlement, a revolutionary leader from one of the world's poorest countries, are not worth the trouble. That's the real mystery, not who did it, but who decided it wasn't worth finding out. If any of these cases affected you, I'd encourage you to look deeper into them. The families in all 3 cases are still to this day waiting for answers. Links to everything I've referenced are in the description. Thank you for watching.